The Mozart piece had reached its crescendo when Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, rushed into the drawing room with the particular urgency that only sudden calamity could produce. Her face, usually composed to the point of rigidity, had gone ashen, and her hands clutched at her apron as though it were the only solid thing in a world suddenly rendered uncertain. The music faltered, then stopped entirely as the musicians noticed the disturbance. Conversations died away in that peculiar cascade of silence that occurs when something fundamentally wrong has occurred, a collective consciousness registering that normalcy had been violated. "Sir Humphrey," Mrs. Pemberton gasped, her voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying through the entire room. "Sir Humphrey there's been an accident. In his study, She could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The implications hung in the air like smoke, and in that suspended moment, Miss Marple watched the gathered company with the intensity of someone observing a stage performance where every gesture held meaning. Eleanor's champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor, the sound startlingly loud in the sudden quiet. Catherine went rigid, her face draining of all color until she appeared almost translucent. Timothy Hartley moved toward the door with an almost reflexive motion, then stopped himself, seeming to remember that such immediate action might appear suspicious. Dr. Ashford, on the other hand, was already moving, his medical training overriding social protocol. "Show me," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to obedience in crisis. Mrs. Pemberton, grateful for someone to take charge, turned and led him from the room with hurried steps. The drawing room descended into controlled chaos. The orchestra members, uncertain of their role in this unfolding drama, huddled near their instruments. Guests clustered in small, anxious groups, their voices rising in urgent speculation. Miss Marple remained precisely where she was, her knitting still resting in her lap, her expression one of mild concern rather than shock. She had lived long enough to understand that the initial moments following a death revealed more about the living than any subsequent investigation ever could. She continued to observe. Catherine had moved to the settee, where she sat with an air of someone whose legs had simply ceased to function. Beside her, Eleanor knelt, one arm around her stepmother's shoulders, though her own expression suggested a complexity of emotions far beyond simple grief. There was shock, certainly, but something else as well, a kind of terrible confirmation, as though Eleanor had been expecting bad news, but perhaps not in this particular form. Miss Marple found this most interesting indeed. Vivian Cole approached Eleanor with genuine concern, her hand reaching out to comfort the younger woman. Timothy, however, appeared almost relieved at this distraction, perhaps grateful to have something to do beyond standing uselessly in the wake of catastrophe. He began quietly asking guests if they wished to retire to the morning room, attempting to restore some semblance of order to the proceedings. His efficiency was admirable, Miss Marple noted, though his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the doorway. Reverend Wells had positioned himself near Mrs. Pemberton, who had remained in the drawing room, seemingly unable to move. "What precisely did you see?" he asked gently, his pastoral experience lending him a natural ability to extract information from the distressed. "When did you discover Sir Humphrey?" Mrs. Pemberton's account came in halting fragments. She had been checking on the study to ensure everything was in order, as she did throughout such events. The door had been slightly ajar, which was unusual. Sir Humphrey always closed it when attending to business. She had knocked, received no response, and pushed the door open to find him slumped in his desk chair, his face turned at an odd angle, his complexion already assuming that peculiar gray pallor that indicated death had occurred some minutes prior rather than moments. "Was there anything unusual?" the Reverend pressed. "Anything that seemed amiss?" "His desk was in disarray," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice barely steady. "Papers scattered, a letter in his hand, and there was a glass, sir, knocked over on the floor beside his chair. It had contained something, I should think. though whatever it was had mostly soaked into the carpet. Miss Marple's fingers continued their steady rhythm with the knitting needles, though her mind was working at considerable speed. A glass, scattered papers, a letter. The implications began forming patterns in her extraordinary mind, connections that others had not yet made and would not make without considerable assistance. Dr. Ashford reappeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "The police must be called," he announced. "Sir Humphrey is quite definitely deceased. There appears to be no natural cause evident, and the circumstances are unusual." The word unusual seemed to hang in the air like a death knell itself. The guests, who had begun to relax slightly, immediately tensed once more. What had promised to be merely a shocking but ultimately understandable pacing now transformed into something far more sinister. In the corner of the drawing room, Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap, her aged eyes reflecting a clarity that belied her apparent tranquility. The real work, she understood, was only just beginning. The police arrived within 40 minutes, their vehicles drawing up to Thornfield Manor with the kind of theatrical urgency that seemed somewhat excessive for a village where violent crime was virtually unknown. Inspector Harold Grayson emerged from the lead car with the bearing of a man who had investigated far graver matters than the death of a country gentleman. His grey suit impeccably pressed despite the summer heat, his eyes carrying the weary skepticism of someone who had seen enough of human nature to trust very little. Behind him came a younger constable and a photographer, along with the village's own police sergeant, a pleasant but rather plodding man named Davies, who had served Little Ashford for 15 years without encountering anything more serious than bicycle thefts and disputes over property boundaries. Inspector Grayson wasted little time in establishing his authority. Within minutes, he had sequestered the drawing room and established a temporary incident room in Sir Humphrey's study, posting constables at both doorways to prevent unauthorized access. The guests, meanwhile, were being herded into various sitting rooms throughout the manor by Mrs. Pemberton and the remaining servants, their earlier social veneer stripped away to reveal the raw anxiety of people caught in circumstances beyond their comprehension or control. Miss Marple had been settled in the morning room with Catherine, Eleanor, and Timothy, a somewhat arbitrary grouping that the inspector had apparently decided represented the immediate family. Vivian and Dr. Ashford had been separated into other rooms, along with the Reverend and several other prominent guests. It was Dr. Ashford who had provided the initial information to the inspector regarding the suspicious nature of Sir Humphrey's death. The positioning of the body, the absence of any medical condition that might have caused sudden collapse, and most significantly, the faint but unmistakable smell of bitter almonds emanating from the study, all of these suggested something far more deliberate than a mere heart attack or stroke. Inspector Grayson had received this information with the grim satisfaction of a man whose instincts had been confirmed, and he had immediately ordered the study sealed and a preliminary examination of the body arranged. In the morning room, tension hung as thick as summer humidity. Catherine sat rigidly on the settee, her hands folded in her lap with such precision that her knuckles had gone white. Occasionally, her eyes would flicker toward Eleanor, who stood near the window with her arms wrapped around herself in a posture of self-protection. Timothy occupied a chair near the door, his leg bouncing with suppressed nervous energy, his eyes darting between the three women as though attempting to gauge which of them might betray him first, a curious reaction, Miss Marple observed, for someone with nothing to hide. "This is utterly dreadful," Catherine said finally, her voice hollow. "I simply cannot comprehend how such a thing could happen. Here, at Thornfield, during a gathering, no less." Eleanor turned from the window, her face composed but her eyes red-rimmed. "Father was in excellent health," she said quietly. "There's no reason he should have simply collapsed. Unless," Timothy interjected, then seemed to think better of his words and closed his mouth abruptly. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself in a comfortable chair with a cup of tea that a thoughtful servant had provided, regarded Timothy with interest. "Unless?" she prompted gently, her tone suggesting nothing more than idle curiosity. Timothy's flush deepened. "I only meant that one never truly knows what health issues someone might be experiencing privately. My own father had a heart condition that none of us suspected until it was far too late." It was a reasonable explanation, yet something in his manner suggested he had been about to say something quite different. Miss Marple filed this away with the same careful precision she applied to everything else. In her experience, what people almost said was often more revealing than what they actually articulated. A constable appeared in the doorway, his expression apologetic. "Inspector Grayson would like to speak with you first, Miss Catherine. If you would please follow me." Catherine rose with visible reluctance, her composure seeming to fragment slightly as she stood. Eleanor moved toward her, offering her hand, but Catherine withdrew almost imperceptibly, a gesture so subtle that Miss Marple alone appeared to notice it. The rejection, unspoken yet unmistakable, hung between them like an accusation. Once Catherine had departed, Eleanor resumed her position by the window, and Timothy returned to his anxious fidgeting. The silence that followed was thick with unasked questions. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully, her mind already cataloguing the peculiarities she had observed. Catherine's relationship with her father-in-law had been distant at best, yet her reaction to his death seemed composed to the point of artificiality. Eleanor's shock appeared genuine, yet there was that strange element of confirmation about it, as though she had been braced for bad news. Timothy's nervousness was understandable in a general sense, yet it possessed a quality that suggested something more specific than mere distress at an unexpected death. Outside the morning room, she could hear the murmur of voices as Inspector Grayson began his preliminary questioning. The summer sun continued its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. Within those shadows, Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting needles still and her hands folded, her aged mind working with the precision of a master clockmaker, examining each detail and considering where it might fit in the larger mechanism of this peculiar tragedy. Inspector Grayson's interview with Catherine lasted approximately 30 minutes, after which she emerged looking even more depleted than before, her eyes avoiding contact with both Eleanor and Timothy. She was escorted to a separate room to await further questioning, her departure leaving a void of speculation in her wake. Eleanor was called next, and the constable's demeanor toward her was noticeably more deferential, a distinction that did not escape Miss Marple's observation. Social hierarchy, she reflected, persisted even in the face of death and suspicion. Finally, Timothy was summoned, his anxiety visibly escalating as he rose from his chair and followed the constable toward the study where the inspector had established his temporary headquarters. Left alone in the morning room, Miss Marple rose with deliberate slowness, her movements economical and purposeful despite her advanced years. A constable remained posted at the doorway, but he appeared young and somewhat uncertain of his duties, displaying the kind of inattention that comes from standing guard over an elderly woman who posed no obvious threat. Miss Marple moved toward the sideboard where a decanter of sherry had been left by the servants, ostensibly for the comfort of those waiting. She poured herself a small glass with careful precision, then settled into a wingback chair positioned at an angle that allowed her to observe both the doorway and, through the partially open door to the corridor, the entrance to Sir Humphrey's study. It was while thus occupied that she witnessed an illuminating moment. Dr. Ashford, evidently having concluded his own interview with the inspector, emerged from the study and encountered Vivian Cole in the corridor. Their interaction lasted only seconds, but it was remarkably expressive. Vivian's face, previously marked by genuine concern and shock, transformed instantly into something altogether different, a kind of controlled neutrality that suggested she was consciously composing herself. Dr. Ashford placed a hand briefly on her arm, and although no words were exchanged within Miss Marple's hearing, the gesture conveyed an intimacy that seemed incongruous with their supposed relationship. Vivian was Timothy's girlfriend, yet here she was exchanging what appeared to be a meaningful glance with the village physician. Most intriguing indeed. Miss Marple continued to observe as the afternoon progressed into evening. Timothy emerged from his interview appearing even more rattled than he had entered, his earlier nervous energy having congealed into something more akin to genuine panic. Eleanor, when she returned to the morning room sometime later, carried herself with an air of careful control, but her hands trembled slightly as she accepted a glass of water from a constable. "The inspector believes it was poisoning," Eleanor said quietly, apparently feeling that there was no longer any point in pretending ignorance. Her voice held the peculiar flatness of someone delivering news that was simultaneously shocking and somehow inevitable. He asked about grandfather's habits, his routine, whether anyone had access to his food or drink. He asked rather pointed questions about the family finances and the terms of grandfather's will. Miss Marple set down her sherry glass with deliberate care. "And what did you tell him regarding the will?" Eleanor's gaze met hers, and in that moment Miss Marple perceived a depth of calculation in the younger woman that had not been apparent before. "I told him the truth," Eleanor said, "that the will is currently being rewritten, that grandfather had been consulting with Mr. Hardwick regarding significant changes to the distribution of his estate." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Miss Marple understood immediately what this meant. If Sir Humphrey had been in the process of altering his will, then the current beneficiaries had every reason to fear what those alterations might entail. She recalled the scene from the afternoon. Sir Humphrey in animated conversation with his solicitor, Eleanor's visible distress, Catherine's trembling hands. A will being rewritten often meant that someone was being written out, their inheritance redirected elsewhere. In a household where multiple people depended upon that inheritance, such a prospect could motivate actions that would not ordinarily be contemplated. "Did your grandfather indicate to you the nature of these changes?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone remaining pleasantly conversational. "He did not confide in me directly," Eleanor replied, though her hesitation suggested there was more to be said. "However, I overheard a conversation between grandfather and Mr. Hardwick this morning. There had been discoveries, matters that had come to light regarding the trustworthiness of certain family members." The phrasing was carefully vague, yet its implications were unmistakable. Someone in the household had fallen from Sir Humphrey's favor. Someone had been discovered to be untrustworthy, whatever that might entail. As evening shadows lengthened across the morning room, Miss Marple found herself contemplating a household suddenly transformed. What had appeared this morning to be a gathering of people united by blood and social obligation now seemed far more fraught with tension, desperation, and potential motivation. A constable appeared in the doorway with news that the guests would be allowed to depart, though they were to remain available for further questioning should it be required. Inspector Grayson had apparently determined that initial interviews had been sufficient for the evening. The guests filtered out into the gathering dusk with expressions ranging from relief to barely concealed anxiety. Miss Marple, however, remained in her chair, her knitting retrieved and her needles resuming their steady, meditative rhythm. Outside, the first stars were beginning to emerge against the darkening sky, and somewhere in Thornfield Manor, a murderer moved about in the awareness that their secret was now known to at least one other person, and that person was unlikely to remain quiet for long. By the following morning, Little Ashford had transformed into a village possessed by a singular obsession. The news of Sir Humphrey's death, initially confined to those who had attended the gala, had spread through the community with the inexorable reach of wildfire, each retelling adding embellishment and speculation in equal measure. The preliminary autopsy results, unofficially communicated through Mrs. Wells to the Reverend to approximately half the parish by midday, confirmed what Dr. Ashford's initial observation had suggested. Sir Humphrey had been poisoned with cyanide, administered through his afternoon tea in the study. The tea service, it had been discovered, bore traces of the toxin, though the cup from which he had drunk had been thoroughly rinsed, suggesting the perpetrator's awareness of the need to obscure evidence. Miss Marple received this information, as she received most village intelligence, through the medium of Mrs. Wells, who arrived at her cottage with freshly baked scones and an expression that betrayed barely suppressed excitement at having become, however tangentially, a participant in such momentous events. The Reverend's wife settled herself in Miss Marple's parlour with the air of someone preparing to deliver particularly juicy gossip, her eyes gleaming with the fervour of the righteously informed. "The inspector believes it must have been someone with access to the study," Mrs. Wells reported, accepting a cup of tea with practised grace. "The poison was not in the main tea service used for the guests. That has been thoroughly examined. It was in Sir Humphrey's personal supply, kept in his study for his private use. Someone must have known about his habit of retiring to work during the gala and must have anticipated his taking tea at that precise time." "Most enlightening," Miss Marple murmured, her needles continuing their rhythmic motion. "And have the police established when precisely the poison was administered?" "Between 3 o'clock and 4:30, the inspector believes. Sir Humphrey was discovered at approximately 4 o'clock, and Dr. Ashford estimates death had occurred perhaps 15 to 20 minutes prior. The poison works quite rapidly, apparently." Miss Marple absorbed this timeline with evident satisfaction. "And the study door was locked, I understand." Mrs. Wells leaned forward conspiratorially. But that is where matters become particularly intriguing. The door was not locked when Sir Humphrey was discovered, though Mrs. Pemberton insists she did not unlock it. Inspector Grayson believes the murderer must have possessed a key or must have locked it after departing and somehow arranged for it to be opened before discovery. Either possibility suggests considerable premeditation and familiarity with the household. After Mrs. Wells departed, bearing with her the satisfaction of having conveyed important information to someone of Miss Marple's standing and wisdom, the elderly detective settled herself in her garden, where the morning glory climbed its trellis in peaceful oblivion to the darker human dramas unfolding nearby. Her mind, however, was working with considerable intensity, assembling facts into patterns, considering implications, and testing theories against observed behavior. She had decided by mid-morning that she required access to certain information that could only be obtained through a more direct approach. Accordingly, she requested that Timothy Hartley call upon her at his earliest convenience. A message delivered through the offices of the Reverend with the particular emphasis that suggested this was not merely a social invitation, but rather a matter of some importance. Timothy arrived at her cottage by late afternoon, his nervousness evident in every hesitant movement and forced smile. "I hope you do not think it forward of me to invite you here," Miss Marple began, offering him a chair and a glass of lemonade, which he accepted with visible relief at having something to do with his hands. "However, I find myself curious about certain matters regarding your recent financial circumstances. You see, I have known your father for some years, and I confess I observed some tension between yourself and Sir Humphrey regarding business matters." Timothy's face flushed deeply. "I don't see how that is any concern of—" "A young man in financial difficulty," Miss Marple continued, her tone remaining pleasantly conversational, "might understandably find himself in a rather precarious position if an elderly relative upon whom he had been depending suddenly altered his intentions regarding inheritance, particularly if that young man had already made commitments based upon expectations that were no longer likely to be fulfilled." Timothy set down his glass with trembling hands. "You cannot possibly think that I think very little without considerable evidence," Miss Marple said mildly. "However, I observe that you were not present in the drawing-room during the 15 minutes preceding Sir Humphrey's discovery. I also observe that you possess, through your employment as estate manager, access to all areas of Thornfield Manor, including Sir Humphrey's study. I further observe that you have recently made financial commitments that seem to exceed your legitimate income, a matter that would naturally become untenable if an anticipated inheritance were to be withdrawn." Timothy rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I want nothing to do with this. If you believe I had something to do with Sir Humphrey's death, then you should inform the inspector, not interrogate me in your parlor like some amateur detective." "I am merely gathering information," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Information that might clarify certain matters in my own mind. Tell me, Mr. Hartley, during that 50-minute interval, where precisely were you?" Timothy's silence was answer enough, though what it signified remained deliberately obscure. He departed Miss Marple's cottage moments later, his exit possessing the quality of retreat, and Miss Marple watched his departure with the expression of someone whose suspicions had been neither confirmed nor dispelled, but rather complicated into something far more interesting than either alternative would have provided. Inspector Grayson's investigation had, by the third day following Sir Humphrey's death, settled into a pattern of methodical questioning and the painstaking examination of household routines. The preliminary forensic work had yielded frustratingly little. The poison had been administered in such a manner as to leave minimal physical evidence, and the tea service itself, having been hastily rinsed, offered no clear fingerprints or identifying marks. However, the inspector's interviews with the household staff had produced one significant revelation. A bottle of cleaning solution containing cyanide, normally stored in a locked cabinet in the servants' quarters, had been discovered to be missing approximately 1 week prior to Sir Humphrey's death. The discrepancy had gone unreported, attributed by the housekeeper to her own forgetfulness regarding inventory management. It was this detail that Miss Marple found most illuminating, for it suggested that the murder had been planned well in advance rather than being an act of passionate impulse. Whoever had taken the poison had done so deliberately, with time to consider the consequences and prepare the mechanism of delivery. This narrowed the field considerably, eliminating those whose motives might be described as spontaneous or reactive. On the afternoon of the third day, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor in the form of Eleanor Blackwell, who arrived at her cottage with the appearance of someone laboring under considerable emotional strain. The young woman's usual composure had eroded considerably, leaving in its place a visible fragility that suggested sleep had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Miss Marple greeted her with her characteristic warmth, settling Eleanor into the parlor's most comfortable chair and placing a cup of chamomile tea within her reach. "I've come to speak with you," Eleanor began without preamble, "because I believe you possess a capacity for understanding that others in this village have not yet demonstrated. The inspector treats me as though I'm either a suspect or a victim, categories that are neither adequate nor accurate. You, however, seem to possess a more nuanced perception of human motivation." Miss Marple regarded her visitor with evident interest. "You have come to confess something, I perceive, or perhaps to confide something that you have not yet shared with the authorities." Eleanor's hands twisted together in her lap. "My grandfather was in the process of changing his will, yes. That much the inspector has discovered. What he has not yet determined is the specific nature of those alterations, and I believe you should know the truth before speculation and gossip create a false narrative." "Please proceed," Miss Marple encouraged gently. "My grandfather discovered, quite recently, that my father, his son, had been engaged in financial improprieties for some years. Not merely gambling or poor investment, but deliberate fraud involving the estate's business interests. When grandfather learned the extent of the embezzlement, he was devastated. But his primary concern was not the money itself. The estate is sufficiently wealthy that such losses, while significant, are not catastrophic. Rather, he was deeply wounded by the betrayal of trust." Miss Marple absorbed this information with evident comprehension. "And your father, Charles, how did he respond to this discovery?" "With denial initially, then with anger, and finally with a kind of desperation. He attempted to convince grandfather that the matters had been exaggerated, that remediation was possible, that the family reputation could be preserved if handled discreetly. Grandfather was unmoved. He intended to rewrite his will to ensure that the bulk of his estate passed to charitable causes and to me directly, bypassing my father entirely. He also intended to inform the authorities regarding the embezzlement. The implications of this revelation were substantial. Eleanor was essentially confirming that her father possessed not merely motive for murder, but also a form of motive that transcended simple financial interest, the motive of preventing exposure and prosecution for crimes he had committed. Yet Eleanor had revealed this information herself, which suggested either a remarkable degree of filial disloyalty or a more complex understanding of the situation than first appeared. "Your father was not at the gala," Miss Marple observed carefully. "No," Eleanor confirmed. "He remained at his London residence, claiming business obligations. He has maintained this alibi throughout the investigation, and the inspector has found no evidence to contradict it." "Yet you believe him to be guilty," Miss Marple stated. Eleanor's silence was profound and eloquent. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I believe my father is capable of many things when his interests are threatened. I also believe that he is intelligent enough to arrange matters from a distance, should he choose to do so. But I cannot know with certainty, and that uncertainty is what torments me. If I accused him without proof, I would destroy our family entirely. If I remain silent and he is guilty, then I become complicit in allowing a murderer to escape justice." Miss Marple reached across and gently patted Eleanor's trembling hand. "You have done the right thing in speaking truthfully about your grandfather's intentions. That information is crucial to understanding the true range of motives operating within this household. However, I would caution you against premature conclusions regarding your father's involvement. There are other individuals within your household whose motives may be equally compelling and whose alibis may be considerably less secure than his appear to be." Eleanor rose to depart some minutes later, appearing neither reassured nor further distressed, but rather possessed of a kind of resigned acceptance. As Miss Marple watched her young visitor disappear down the garden path, her mind was already reassessing the architecture of the case. If Charles Blackwell was indeed guilty but had maintained an alibi through distance, then the question became not who had administered the poison, but rather who had administered it on his behalf. And that was a far more complex puzzle indeed. The revelation regarding Charles Blackwell's financial improprieties had catalyzed a shift in Inspector Grayson's investigative approach, though Miss Marple noted that the inspector's initial enthusiasm for pursuing the absent father as the prime suspect had been tempered by the practical difficulty of proving his involvement in a crime committed at a location he had demonstrably not occupied. By the fourth day following the murder, Grayson had begun to focus his attention more intensively upon those individuals present at Thornfield Manor during the critical 15-minute window, a narrowing of focus that had resulted in the intensification of his interviews with both Catherine and Timothy Hartley. It was through the offices of Constable Davies, who maintained a friendly relationship with the village postman and thus received regular updates on official matters, that Miss Marple learned of a significant development. The constable had, quite by accident, overheard Inspector Grayson and a Scotland Yard chemist discussing evidence regarding the manner in which the poison had been introduced into Sir Humphrey's tea. The conclusion reached was that the poison could not have been introduced into the tea service itself, as such an action would have resulted in detectable symptoms in other individuals who had consumed from the same service. Rather, the poison must have been introduced directly into Sir Humphrey's personal cup, either before he consumed the tea or at the precise moment of consumption. This suggested not merely access to the study, but specific knowledge of Sir Humphrey's precise whereabouts and routine at a particular moment. Miss Marple considered this information while engaged in the innocent activity of tending to her roses, her pruning shears moving with economical precision as she considered the implications. The knowledge required suggested either someone who had been carefully observing Sir Humphrey's movements throughout the afternoon, or someone who possessed such intimate familiarity with his habits as to predict them with virtual certainty. Timothy Hartley, in his capacity as estate manager, would certainly have possessed such knowledge. Catherine, as his daughter-in-law and a permanent resident of the household, would similarly have been aware of his routines. But there was another individual who possessed equal knowledge and whose motive had thus far been inadequately examined: Dr. Marcus Ashford. The village physician, Miss Marple, recalled, had arrived at the gala early, ostensibly to assist in case any guest experienced medical distress. He had been afforded access to all areas of the manor by virtue of his professional status and his long-standing relationship with the family. Moreover, she had observed that peculiar exchange between Dr. Ashford and Vivian Cole on the evening of the murder, an exchange that suggested an intimacy considerably deeper than professional acquaintance or casual friendship might explain. Miss Marple resolved to pursue this line of inquiry more deliberately, and accordingly she paid a social call upon Dr. Ashford's residence on the following afternoon, presenting herself at his surgery under the pretext of requiring a consultation regarding a minor complaint. Nothing serious, she assured him with her characteristic disarming manner, merely the inevitable diminishments of advanced age requiring professional verification. Dr. Ashford, evidently relieved to encounter a social obligation unrelated to murder investigation, received her warmly and ushered her into his consulting room with evident pleasure. During the course of their conversation, Miss Marple skillfully steered the discussion toward Sir Humphrey's health, remarking upon how well the older man had seemed at the gala, despite his evident preoccupation with business matters. Dr. Ashford, perhaps grateful to discuss something beyond the murder investigation, responded with his professional assessment that Sir Humphrey had been in generally robust health, though he had mentioned to the doctor some months prior that he was experiencing occasional heart palpitations, a matter of little concern, the physician noted, but sufficient to warrant periodic monitoring. "Had Sir Humphrey consulted with you recently regarding his medical condition?" Miss Marple inquired with apparent casualness. "Actually, no," Dr. Ashford replied, a shadow crossing his features. "He had not attended for consultation in some months, which is perhaps a matter I should have pursued more actively, given his age and the nature of his previous concerns." Miss Marple noted the presence of guilt in this response, a guilt that seemed disproportionate to the mere failure to pursue routine medical follow-up. She filed this observation away and continued with her gentle interrogation, inquiring about the doctor's relationship with various members of the household, his observations regarding Timothy Hartley's financial difficulties, his professional opinion on Catherine's apparent anxiety. With each question, she watched Dr. Ashford's responses with the meticulous attention of someone cataloguing far more than the mere words being spoken. It was when she commented upon Vivian Cole's apparent distress on the evening of the murder that she observed a distinct alteration in Dr. Ashford's composure. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and a flash of something that might have been anxiety crossed his features before he regained his professional equanimity. "Miss Cole is a young woman of considerable sensitivity," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. "The shock of Sir Humphrey's death affected her deeply. Yet I observe she and Mr. Hartley have a rather complicated relationship," Miss Marple mused aloud. "I wonder if Miss Cole might not be more intimately connected to other members of the household. I noted a certain familiarity between yourself and Miss Cole during the evening in question. Professional concern, I imagine, but it appeared rather more personal than that." Dr. Ashford rose from his chair with sudden abruptness. "I believe our consultation is concluded, Miss Marple. I trust you will find yourself in good health. Should you require further medical attention, please do not hesitate to contact my surgery." The dismissal was unmistakable, and Miss Marple departed his residence with the satisfied expression of someone who had obtained precisely the reaction they sought. The fear in Dr. Ashford's eyes, she reflected, suggested involvement that extended considerably beyond the merely professional. The question now became not whether the good doctor possessed motive and opportunity, but whether he possessed the specific knowledge and capability to transform those factors into action. Miss Marple's departure from Dr. Ashford's surgery marked a subtle but significant shift in the investigation's trajectory. Though neither Inspector Grayson nor the other principals involved in the case were yet aware of the elderly woman's emerging conclusions. She spent the remainder of that afternoon in her garden, ostensibly engaged in the cultivation of her flower beds, while her mind traversed the increasingly complex labyrinth of motivations, secrets, and interconnections that characterize the household of Thornfield Manor. By evening, she had determined that she required one additional piece of information that could only be obtained through a conversation with Vivian Cole. It proved easier to arrange than Miss Marple might have anticipated. Through the gentle intervention of Mrs. Wells, who had expressed concern for the young woman's well-being following such traumatic events, an invitation was extended for Vivian to take tea with Miss Marple on the following afternoon. Vivian arrived at the cottage with an air of apprehension barely concealed beneath a veneer of social politeness, her eyes betraying a wariness that suggested she understood, at some level, that this was not merely a social call, but rather an interrogation conducted under the guise of hospitality. "You are wondering why I've asked you here," Miss Marple began, once the preliminary courtesies had been observed, and Vivian was settled in the parlor with a cup of oolong tea before her. "I suspect you may harbor some anxiety regarding my motivations, and I would therefore prefer to address matters directly rather than through the circuitous approach that social convention might ordinarily dictate." Vivian's hands tightened on her teacup. "I'm not certain what you mean, Miss Marple." "I mean," Miss Marple said with gentle but unmistakable clarity, "that I have observed you possess knowledge regarding certain matters that you have not yet shared with the authorities investigating Sir Humphrey's death. I further observe that your relationship with Timothy Hartley appears to be considerably less straightforward than it initially presents itself, and that your interactions with Dr. Marcus Ashford suggest a far more intimate connection than mere professional acquaintance would explain." The color drained from Vivian's face with remarkable rapidity. She set down her teacup with a trembling hand, the china rattling audibly against the saucer. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, though her voice suggested uncertainty. "Whatever you believe you have observed." "I believe," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that you have been placed in an extraordinarily difficult position by individuals more experienced in manipulation than yourself. I further believe that you possess information that might clarify matters considerably, and that you are uncertain whether to come forward because you fear the consequences of such action. However, I would suggest to you that remaining silent is both morally indefensible and ultimately far more dangerous than truthfulness would prove to be." Vivian rose abruptly and walked to the window, her back rigid with tension. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Dr. Ashford and I have been involved for some months. Before I began my relationship with Timothy, I had attempted to sever the connection, to commit myself fully to Timothy, but Dr. Ashford—" She trailed off, incapable of articulating whatever it was that Dr. Ashford had done. "Dr. Ashford insisted upon maintaining the relationship," Miss Marple supplied, "perhaps through threats or implied consequences. Perhaps by manipulating your emotions and your sense of obligation to him. Am I correct?" Vivian turned to face her, and tears had begun to stream down her cheeks. "He said that if I did not continue to see him, he would ensure that Timothy learned of our previous involvement. He said it would destroy my relationship, that he would make certain Timothy knew. I was terrified, Miss Marple. I did not know what to do. And on the day of the gala," Miss Marple continued, "did Dr. Ashford request your assistance with some matter? Some task that seemed innocuous at the time, but that you later came to understand might have been connected to Sir Humphrey's death?" Vivian's silence was answer enough. She sank back into her chair, appearing suddenly diminished, as though the weight of withheld information had been physically crushing her. "He asked me to place a small package in Sir Humphrey's study," she said finally. "He told me it was a gift, a surprise, and that he wished to arrange it as a gesture of gratitude for some past kindness. He said Sir Humphrey would find it amusing, I did as he asked because I was afraid to refuse him. And did you observe what was contained within this package? No, it was wrapped and sealed. I simply placed it on Sir Humphrey's desk as instructed. Miss Marple rose with deliberate slowness and moved to her small writing desk, where she composed a brief note addressed to Inspector Grayson. She sealed it and handed it to Vivian, with instructions to deliver it personally to the inspector's temporary office at Thornfield Manor. "You must tell him everything you have told me," Miss Marple instructed. "Tell him about your relationship with Dr. Ashford, about the package, about his threats. The truth, however difficult, is your only path to redemption and to genuine safety." After Vivian's departure, Miss Marple settled herself in her favorite chair with her knitting, though her needles remained still in her lap as she gazed out toward the gathering twilight. The architecture of the murder was becoming increasingly clear, the interconnected motivations and manipulations that had culminated in Sir Humphrey's death revealing themselves in logical sequence. Yet one crucial question remained unanswered. What had Dr. Ashford hoped to accomplish by eliminating Sir Humphrey, and how precisely did this crime serve his interests? The answer to that question, Miss Marple suspected, would lie not in what had been done, but rather in what had been prevented from occurring. Vivian Cole's confession, delivered to Inspector Grayson with all the reluctant urgency of someone finally unburdening themselves of an intolerable secret, transformed the investigation in a manner that was both immediate and profound. Within hours of receiving the young woman's account, Grayson had obtained a warrant to search Dr. Ashford's residence and surgery, a search that yielded a discovery of considerable significance. Among the physician's personal papers was found a letter from Sir Humphrey Blackwell dated approximately 6 months prior, in which the doctor had been informed that Sir Humphrey had discovered evidence of what appeared to be a criminal relationship between Dr. Ashford and a patient. Specifically, evidence suggesting that Dr. Ashford had been prescribing controlled substances to individuals in exchange for financial compensation, a practice that would constitute not merely professional misconduct, but outright criminal fraud. The letter further indicated that Sir Humphrey, who had served as a trustee for the local medical board, had intended to bring these matters to the attention of the appropriate authorities. Sir Humphrey had offered Dr. Ashford an opportunity to cease the practice and to make reparations, but had made it clear that if such measures were not undertaken within a specified time frame, he would be compelled to report the matter officially. The deadline for this ultimatum had been mere days before Sir Humphrey's death. Inspector Grayson, armed with this crucial information, had brought Dr. Ashford in for formal questioning by late afternoon on the day following Vivian's confession. The interrogation, conducted in the presence of a solicitor who appeared increasingly resigned to the inevitability of his client's culpability, revealed a man stripped of professional composure and reduced to a creature operating primarily from the impulses of self-preservation and desperation. When confronted with the evidence of his fraudulent prescribing practices and informed of Vivian's testimony regarding the package placed in Sir Humphrey's study, Dr. Ashford's resistance crumbled with surprising rapidity. He confessed, in a voice that seemed to belong to someone far older and more diminished than the confident professional who had presented himself to the village for so many years, to having obtained cyanide through irregular channels, connections established during his years of medical practice, and to having prepared a mechanism for its administration that would ensure Sir Humphrey's death while minimizing the risk of immediate discovery. The package, ostensibly containing a gift, had actually contained a small device designed to release the poison into Sir Humphrey's tea at a predetermined time, triggered by the addition of hot liquid. Dr. Ashford had calibrated the mechanism with meticulous precision, calculating the exact moment at which Sir Humphrey would typically retire to his study for his afternoon tea during the gala. What Dr. Ashford had not calculated with equal precision was the degree of disruption that would attend a major social gathering, nor the unexpected alterations to Sir Humphrey's routine that such disruptions would entail. By extraordinary misfortune, or perhaps, from the perspective of justice, by extraordinary providence, Sir Humphrey had been delayed in his retirement to the study by an extended conversation with several of his guests. This delay had resulted in the poison mechanism activating approximately 20 minutes before Sir Humphrey consumed the tea, rendering the deadly compound far more potent through concentration and oxidation than Dr. Ashford's calculations had anticipated. What had been designed as a murder that might plausibly be attributed to a heart attack or natural cause had instead produced symptoms so characteristic of poisoning that suspicion had been immediate. With Dr. Ashford's confession secured and his solicitor making preliminary arrangements for his formal remand in custody pending trial, Inspector Grayson had appeared at Miss Marple's cottage that evening, his expression suggesting a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and personal chagrin at having required the elderly woman's assistance in resolving the case. He had been courteous but frank in acknowledging her role in directing his investigation toward the correct suspect, and had expressed what appeared to be genuine appreciation for her insights and observations. "I confess," Grayson had said, accepting a cup of tea in Miss Marple's parlor, "that I find myself somewhat humbled by this entire affair. The evidence against both Timothy Hartley and Catherine Blackwell appeared so compelling that I was disposed to pursue one or the other of them with considerable vigor. Yet your observations suggested that I was attending to surface matters rather than underlying motivations." Miss Marple smiled with gentle modesty. "I merely observed what was present for anyone to observe, Inspector. The difficulty lies not in observing, but in correctly interpreting what one observes. Dr. Ashford was, on the surface, a man of standing and respectability. Yet there were certain inconsistencies in his behavior, certain interactions that suggested depths of involvement beyond what his official role would explain. Once one entertains the possibility of guilt, the evidence begins to arrange itself in logical sequence." After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor as darkness fell outside her windows. The case was resolved. Justice had been served, and the community of Little Ashford would gradually return to its comfortable rhythms of daily life. Yet Miss Marple found herself contemplating not the resolution, but the revelation, the understanding that beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives existed capacities for corruption, manipulation, and violence that most people preferred not to acknowledge. Dr. Ashford's crime had not emerged from vacancy or spontaneous impulse, but rather from a calculated determination to preserve what he valued: his reputation, his status, his freedom, at any cost. She thought of Vivian Cole, whose unfortunate involvement in the affair had stemmed from nothing more than a momentary weakness and a subsequent inability to escape the consequences of that weakness. She thought of Timothy Hartley and Catherine Blackwell, innocent yet bearing the burden of suspicion. She thought of Eleanor Blackwell, who had acted with considerable courage in revealing the truth about her father's embezzlement, thereby directing attention toward the complex matrix of motivations that had ultimately led to murder. And she thought of Sir Humphrey himself, a man who had attempted to act with justice and integrity, only to discover that such qualities could themselves become targets for those willing to resort to violence to preserve their own wrongdoing. The formal conclusion of the investigation did not, as Miss Marple had anticipated, restore Little Ashford to its former state of comfortable equilibrium. Rather, the revelation of Dr. Ashford's crimes and the subsequent uncovering of Charles Blackwell's financial improprieties had created a profound rupture in the social fabric of the village, one that no amount of time or discretion seemed capable of mending. The scandals surrounding a man of Dr. Ashford's prominence, a physician who had been trusted with the health and well-being of virtually every family in the community, extended far beyond the simple fact of murder. The discovery of his fraudulent prescribing practices had implications that touched numerous individuals whose names had appeared in his patient records, creating a web of embarrassment, anxiety, and mutual suspicion that permeated the very foundation of village society. Within a week of Dr. Ashford's arrest, 2 patients had been admitted to a private clinic for treatment of substance dependency, a circumstance that set tongues wagging with the particular fervor that attends the discovery of hidden vice among those believed to be respectable. Mrs. Pemberton had submitted her resignation from Thornfield Manor, explaining to anyone who would listen that she could no longer remain in a household touched by such darkness, despite the fact that the household itself bore no responsibility for the crimes that had been committed. The Reverend had delivered a sermon of considerable length addressing the nature of temptation and the fragility of human virtue, a sermon that many parishioners interpreted as an indictment of their collective failure to perceive the corruption that had been occurring within their midst. Catherine Blackwell, freed from suspicion but burdened with the knowledge of her husband's embezzlement and her father-in-law's murder, had retreated into a state of severe melancholy that concerned those closest to her. Eleanor had assumed the responsibility of managing the household and the estate's immediate affairs, a burden that would have been considerable for anyone, let alone a young woman of 24, still processing the trauma of recent events. Charles Blackwell remained in London, ostensibly attending to legal matters related to the discovery of his fraudulent activities, though the village understood that he was actually engaged in arrangements with the authorities regarding the extent and consequences of his embezzlement. It was Timothy Hartley whose situation proved most immediately altered by the resolution of the case. Free at last from the burden of suspicion and, more importantly, from the financial pressures that had driven him toward increasingly questionable decisions, Timothy had undergone what might be described as a genuine transformation of character. He had terminated his relationship with Vivian Cole with a courtesy that surprised those who had observed their previous interactions and had begun to demonstrate a more genuine commitment to his employment responsibilities at Thornfield. His financial circumstances, while still constrained, were rendered considerably less desperate by the news that Eleanor had determined to retain his services and to provide him with expanded responsibilities within the estate management structure. Vivian Cole, for her part, had endured a period of considerable social ostracism following the revelation of her involvement in the affair, a consequence that Miss Marple found particularly troubling. The young woman's primary crime had been a lack of courage in the face of manipulation and intimidation, yet little Ashford seemed disposed to treat her with a severity that suggested far greater culpability. Miss Marple had made a point of extending particular kindnesses to Vivian during this period, invitations to tea, introductions to other individuals of progressive sentiment, and most importantly, the public demonstration of respect and regard that served as a counterweight to the community's judgment. It was during one such afternoon, approximately 3 weeks following Dr. Ashford's confession, that Miss Marple found herself engaged in conversation with Vivian on a bench situated in the village's small public garden. The younger woman had gradually recovered some measure of her former composure, though her eyes retained a wariness born of recent trauma. "Do you think," Vivian asked, "that Dr. Ashford would have actually exposed my relationship with Timothy if I had refused to place the package in Sir Humphrey's study?" Miss Marple considered the question with evident care before responding. "I believe Dr. Ashford would have threatened such exposure, and I believe you would have experienced considerable anxiety regarding his capacity to carry out that threat. However, I also believe that Dr. Ashford's primary concern was his own preservation, and that such preservation required the elimination of Sir Humphrey far more urgently than it required the manipulation of your personal affairs. The threat, in other words, was real, but the likelihood of its execution was considerably less certain than Dr. Ashford desired you to believe." "Then I might have refused him," Vivian said quietly, "and nothing would have occurred except perhaps some social awkwardness." "One can never know with absolute certainty what might have occurred had different choices been made," Miss Marple replied. "However, I would suggest that you not punish yourself further for having been manipulated by someone considerably more experienced in such matters than yourself. The capacity to recognize manipulation and to resist it is a skill developed only through experience. often painful experience. You have now acquired that skill, and the price you have paid for it, while considerable, is not entirely without value. The conversation drifted toward other matters, yet Miss Marple's words seemed to settle within Vivian like seeds that might eventually produce growth and healing. As the afternoon light began to slant across the garden, Miss Marple reflected that this too was part of the aftermath of murder. Not merely the resolution of the crime and the apprehension of the guilty, but the slow, difficult process through which a community and its individuals came to terms with the revelations of hidden darkness and the recognition that such darkness resided not in some distant corner of the world, but within the very hearts and minds of those with whom they lived and worked. By the autumn of that year, Little Ashford had begun the slow process of returning to its accustomed patterns, though the village remained subtly altered by the events of the summer, scarred in ways that were not immediately visible but deeply embedded in the collective consciousness of its inhabitants. The trial of Dr. Marcus Ashford had concluded in September with a conviction for murder, resulting in a sentence of life imprisonment that had been received by the village with a mixture of satisfaction and lingering unease. Justice, it seemed, was an incomplete remedy for the violation of trust that his crimes had represented. Miss Marple had been invited to provide testimony at the trial, a circumstance that had thrust her into an unfamiliar position of public prominence. The experience had been exhausting rather than gratifying, though she recognized it as necessary to the process of establishing truth in the formal structures through which society administered justice. She had returned to Little Ashford with evident relief, resuming her quiet patterns of daily life with a particular emphasis on the cultivation of her garden and the companionable silence that characterized her relationship with her knitting. It was on a particularly pleasant afternoon in October, as the leaves were beginning their transformation into shades of amber and crimson, that Eleanor Blackwell called upon Miss Marple with what appeared to be a matter of some importance. The young woman had matured considerably in the month since her grandfather's death. The burden of managing Thornfield Manor and navigating the complex aftermath of her father's embezzlement having accelerated a process of personal development that might otherwise have required years to accomplish. "I have come to thank you," Eleanor said, settling herself in Miss Marple's parlor with the ease of someone who had become accustomed to such visits, "and to inform you of certain decisions I have made regarding the future management of the estate and my family's affairs." Miss Marple gestured for her visitor to continue, her needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she listened with evident attention. "My father," Eleanor explained, "has agreed to cooperate fully with the authorities regarding his embezzlement activities. In exchange, he has been permitted to resign from his position with the family business rather than face formal prosecution. He has made restitution for the funds he misappropriated, and he has undertaken to undertake a period of psychological counseling to address the circumstances that led him toward such actions in the first place." "And your family?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "We remain fragmented," Eleanor admitted. "My mother has decided to remain with my father, though their marriage is considerably strained. My stepmother, Catherine, has taken a residence in Bath with the intention of establishing some distance from the painful associations connected with Thornfield. I suspect she will eventually recover her emotional equilibrium, though the process will require considerable time." "And you have remained," Miss Marple observed. "I have remained," Eleanor confirmed. "I have determined to take a more active role in the management of the estate, working closely with Timothy Hartley to implement reforms that will both improve the financial stability of our holdings and ensure that the practices of transparency and ethical conduct that my grandfather valued are maintained going forward. It seemed to me that to abandon Thornfield would constitute a kind of betrayal of his memory and his principles." Miss Marple smiled with evident approval. "You have chosen the more difficult path, I perceive, but undoubtedly the more rewarding one. The capacity to transform tragedy into purpose is a quality possessed by relatively few individuals." Eleanor rose to depart some time later, but paused at the doorway as though confronting a question she had been hesitant to ask. "Do you ever regret," she inquired, "the degree to which your investigations into these matters resulted in pain for various individuals? I refer particularly to those who, while not guilty of murder, nonetheless found themselves implicated in circumstances that damaged their reputations and their peace of mind." Miss Marple considered the question with evident seriousness before responding. "I have long ago concluded that truth, while sometimes painful, is ultimately preferable to comfortable deception. The pain experienced by Timothy Hartley and by Vivian Cole in the aftermath of suspicion, while genuine, was temporary and produced ultimately in growth and clarification. Comfort purchased at the price of allowing a murderer to escape justice would constitute a far greater harm. Moreover, I have found that those individuals of genuine character ultimately survive such trials and emerge with enhanced understanding of themselves and their world." After Eleanor's departure, Miss Marple sat in her garden as the afternoon light began its gradual retreat toward evening. She thought of the summer that had passed, the murder, the investigation, the gradual unraveling of secrets and hidden corruptions that had transformed a peaceful village into a site of tragedy and revelation. She thought of Dr. Ashford, now imprisoned and reflecting perhaps on the choices that had led him toward such desperate action. She thought of the various individuals whose lives had been altered by these events, each forced to confront aspects of themselves and their circumstances that they might have preferred to leave undisturbed. Yet as she surveyed the garden she had tended for so many years, with its familiar flowers and established patterns, Miss Marple recognized that this too was the nature of human existence, a constant tension between the desire for stability and the inevitability of change, between the comfort of illusion and the demand for truth. The village of Little Ashford would continue, as villages do, adapting to new circumstances, gradually incorporating the lessons of recent tragedy into its collective consciousness, and eventually, perhaps, achieving a new equilibrium that incorporated both the memory of what had occurred and the recognition that life, in its essential nature, must continue. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, and the needles resumed their meditative rhythm as twilight descended over the garden. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, marking time's passage with its familiar call. The mystery of Sir Humphrey Blackwell's death had been resolved, justice had been served, and the complicated work of healing could now proceed in earnest. And in her quiet way, having accomplished what needed to be accomplished, Miss Marple remained precisely where she had always been, observing, understanding, and bearing witness to the endlessly complex dramas of human nature that unfolded around her, with the inevitability of seasons changing and flowers blooming and fading in their appointed time.